We have Joe Ferretti, I think, via telephone. Yeah, we got Joe. Good morning.
I'm here.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm here. No, not disconnected.
Very nice. Right. So Joe is, I think John just called you the show's consigliere, right?
That's it. That's right.
So
I wanted to use an Italian word for you during the break. I wanted to get on your good side.
I appreciate that, John, and I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, just don't, so long as you don't say consigliere. It's just silent G.
Yes.
You know you got a language and you have a silent G. Like we have a silent E in English. Nothing. Italy, we got a silent G.
Although wasn't...
so it's not gangster, it's
wasn't
angster.
the Corleone's consigliere a
Robert Duvall.
Yeah, he was an Italian. A Irishman, wasn't he? Tom Hagen?
Tom Hagen?
Yeah, Tom Hagen. That's right. He was of Irish descent, which was a source of a little internal strife in the family, if you recall. Right?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm just saying Irish and Italians can work together. We're the example, Rob.
I think it is.
After we all throw down a few, yeah.
Then we're all brothers.
Yeah, that's right.
Joe, let's talk about some Supreme Court cases here, and start off with Venezuela.
Yeah, it's a busy time, and it's interesting, Rob, that so many of these cases now that we're hearing about in the media, they're being handled on an emergency basis, and it's because of whether you love it or hate it, the Trump administration is moving forward on a lot of their policies, and it's getting the courts involved at a breakneck pace, and up go the cases to the Supreme Court, many of them on an emergency basis. And so the court is pumping out orders, sometimes very, very basic 1 or 2 page orders, either affirming what the lower courts have done or overturning it so that the Trump administration can proceed with some of their policies. So one of them was the Venezuela case, and I think some background information is necessary to understand what's going on here. We have approximately 350,000 Venezuelans in this country under what's called temporary protective status. And what that is, it's a government designation for people who have fled their own country, their homeland, due to violence or security concerns or threats of violence, and they flee. And we know that Venezuela has been through a lot lately with the Maduro government and how he came to power under very suspicious activity down there. In fact, the UN had observed the election and said there was unquestioned fraud in the election. But nevertheless, he's in power, and there are a lot of extrajudicial killings and a lot of people being disappeared. So the Venezuelans have left the country. Estimated 7 million people have left. 350,000 end up here. And in 2021 and 2023, the Biden administration granted these Venezuelans this temporary protective status. On his way out the door, President Biden extended that protective status, meaning they could remain here, work here, live here, and remain here until 2026. I think it was April of 2026 when that was going to expire. Well, the Trump administration came aboard and immediately started reviewing the situation with the Venezuelans. And on January 28th, Homeland Security said, okay, we're now reviewing the situation. On February 5th, these Venezuelans are told your TPS, temporary protective status protections, expire on April 7th. So get ready to get out. On March 31st, a lower court judge decided that no, the status should remain because there's now lawsuits pending over whether or not that protective status can be revoked by the Trump administration. And then on May 19th, which was just, I think, this Monday, the TPS protections were, we think, revoked by the U.S. Supreme Court. The 2-page order is... it doesn't explain a whole lot, but it basically says that the underlying injunction granted by the district court judge is stayed, and the Trump administration can proceed with their review of the status of these Venezuelans and whether or not they should remain while the lawsuits are pending. So the thorny little issue here is with the Trump administration seemingly willing to get people out of here pretty quickly, some people may be put on planes and sent elsewhere across the globe, and while their lawsuits are pending here. And that becomes a little bit of an unworkable situation, but that's where we are right now. And so there's 350,000 Venezuelans right now that don't know whether they're going to be allowed to remain in their homes or whether they're going to be put on a plane and sent elsewhere.
Well, the argument that I have heard about this is, we open a spigot and let millions of undocumented illegal people into the country illegally. I mean, it's just without papers. And it's unwieldy and unthinkable that each one of those millions of people get to have a trial before they are deported for reasons of being here illegally.
Well, that's true in the overall immigration debate, John, as to what to do with people who have crossed the border illegally. But these folks were basically granted asylum. They were granted the ability to be here. They were placed under a legal status where they check in, they file paperwork, they let Homeland Security and the immigration authorities know where they're living and what they're doing. And many of these people were able to get jobs and maintain a home. And they were here legally under that TPS status. And now the football is being kicked back and forth is whether or not that status should remain. The Trump administration is arguing that conditions on the ground in Venezuela have improved to the point that these people should be able to go home. But these people are arguing on contraire. If we go back home, we could be disappeared, or we could be subject to all kinds of bad conduct on the part of the Maduro government. And the conditions have not changed, and we still need to have safe haven here. So the narrow question with the Venezuelans is what to do about their legal status that they were granted here. But overall, I think you're correct. We've had a lot of people come in illegally, and what do we do about them? And that gets into the case of those other Venezuelans and whether they're in gangs and whether they're a threat to our country or whether they're taxing our resources to the point that we can't tolerate them here anymore.
And what about the whole business of lower courts, district courts? I'm going to get over my skis here because I'm not sure what the titles are. But we have lower courts taking on one case in a locality, and wherever this was, California, Utah, wherever, and then extrapolating the judgment to the entire country. And I've also heard the argument that those courts don't have the jurisdiction to do that.
But, right. Well, that brings us to our second case, which was the birthright citizenship case. That's Trump versus the state of Washington, Trump versus New Jersey, Trump versus CASA, which are the court-appointed special advocates that we sometimes talk about there in the Eastern Panhandle. Their nationwide group also brought a case over the executive order regarding Trump's attempt to rescind birthright citizenship, which is stated in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, what happened there, John, is, as you correctly indicated, was the debate boiled down to the ability of these district courts to grant these injunctions that have nationwide effect. And in the case of this birthright citizenship case, a California district court said that the executive order issued by President Trump was clearly illegal under the Constitution. In fact, I think it was a Reagan-appointed judge said it was the easiest decision he's ever had to make as a judge. That the birthright citizenship executive order is going nowhere. But the U.S. solicitor, which is the Trump administration's attorney to argue cases before the Supreme Court, brought forth the narrower issue of whether or not an injunction granted, for example, in the state of California, on birthright citizenship would have nationwide effect. And this goes back even before, this predates Trump. This goes back to even the Obama administration, which railed about these district court judges granting these nationwide injunctions and foiling the efforts of the current presidential administration to enact their policies. So the debate before the Supreme Court was pretty interesting in that, as a practical matter, and I think Justice Kagan brought this up very adroitly. She said, look, if a court or if a Texas, let's say a president comes into office and issues an executive order, which is clearly wrong. Let's say it's gun confiscation. Okay, we're going to take all the handguns away because violence in our society is just too pervasive. We need to do something. And then a district court in Texas comes forward and says, well, you're not going to do that in the state of Texas. We got a Second Amendment right down here in Texas, and we honor that. So the district court judges issues an order saying the president's executive order confiscating guns is clearly illegal. Now, should that have nationwide effect? I think a lot of people would argue, yeah. But as Justice Kagan pointed out, if they don't have nationwide effect, then you're going to compel gun owners in every state with every district court. You're going to compel them to have to go to the court and file similar lawsuits, and just to protect their Second Amendment rights. So in some instances, the Supreme Court justices were able to point out that nationwide effect for these injunctions coming from lower courts are necessary and, as a practical matter, very important. In other cases, maybe cases that don't involve core constitutional issues, maybe district court decisions should not have nationwide effect. That's the debate that the Supreme Court really addressed in the birthright citizenship case, and I think it's one they're going to grapple with, and ultimately they're going to enter a decision on this sometime in this summer. I expect some kind of hybrid decision by the Supreme Court on that issue itself. Birthright citizenship alone, as a standalone issue, the way I read the Constitution, I don't think that's going anywhere. But it was used as a vehicle to argue the question about injunctions.
Did the United States, the solicitor, the political side of this argument, did they articulate how the Constitution does not say what the Constitution clearly says in the 14th Amendment?
You mean about birthright citizenship?
Birthright citizenship. Is there some clause, comma?
They're making the argument that in the 14th Amendment, there's something to the effect that it subject to the jurisdiction thereof, meaning that not only did someone born in this country have to establish that they were actually born here, but also that they were somehow subject to the jurisdiction thereof, meaning that if their parents were, let's say, illegal immigrants, in the example, they are not subject to the jurisdiction of this country because they're not citizens here, so their offspring can't be subject to the jurisdiction. That was the nuanced argument that was and has been advocated by some people on the right to curtail the effects of the birthright citizenship clause of the Constitution. I don't think that's going to fly. I think courts have looked at this going back to 1898 and have always upheld the basic rule that if you're born on this soil, you're a U.S. citizen. And so there'd have to be an overturning of 125 years of precedent to get to where some people want to get on the question of birthright citizenship.
Is the 14th Amendment an outgrowth of the Civil War and slavery and making sure that slaves are full citizens of the United States?
Yeah, it was one of the reasons. But and that has been argued that birthright citizenship is just a vestige of the Civil War era, does not apply broadly. But that's the very issue that the Supreme Court has grappled with in the last 125 years, starting with, I can't remember the name of the case, but it's from 1898. And that the Supreme Court has consistently held that that's one of the reasons why we have birthright citizenship. It's not the only one. and that the courts have consistently upheld that. In fact, Congress has codified certain laws since 1898 and the first Supreme Court effort to address birthright citizenship. Congress has codified many aspects of our life with the assumption that people born here are citizens here. So in terms of their ability to get certain benefits of citizenship, whether it be government programs or benefits or things of that nature, we have laws on the books that operate under the basic tenet that if you're born here, you are not only subject to the laws of this country, but also you gain the benefits. The
Trump administration, Joe, had made the argument that we were the only country that actually did this. We were the only country that provided citizenship.
That's flatly wrong. That is flatly wrong. There's many countries across the globe that have birthright citizenship similar to ours in terms of if you're born there, you're a citizen there.
And getting back to John's case, and I know we did an interview with you on this a couple of months ago, but in regards to the 14th Amendment, it's one thing, some say, when you're dealing with what was then slavery, where you take people against their will, bring them to your country, and then they have children in your country, which is now their country. And it's one thing to say that those children are citizens because they were born in America. It's another to illegally break into a country, not have citizenship, and then have children in that country and refer to them as citizens. That's another argument that's been made against this case, Joe. Would you say that the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld that as citizenship?
Yeah, that's correct. You're right. That's the argument about anchor babies, which I'm sorry is a pejorative term, but is one that's used, where people try to gain entry into the country illegally and then quickly conceive and have a child and then try to argue that, what are you going to do? My child's a citizen. You can't kick me out. And remember, that was the whole family separation policy that was in place under Trump administration 1 from 2016 to 2020. That involved that argument there. But yeah, our courts have looked at it, Rob, and I can't think of, and nor have I read, where there has been a Supreme Court decision or even a lower court decision that has seemingly attempted to cut back on the notion that if you're born here, you're a U.S. citizen.
I'm going to go ahead. Because I'm going to change the subject back.
Just being devil's advocate on this, I don't think anybody ever anticipated opening the zipper along the border and just letting people flood in the way they have. That's the other factor that weighs in on this, right? I mean, it's one thing to have kind of a controlled trickle of illegals coming across the border, which has historically always been the case, and as opposed to this 4 years of y'all come, and we're talking literally millions of people. That's it's also a challenge for deportation, actually. But I don't know if this is a great time to be a Supreme Court justice or the worst time to be a Supreme Court justice.
If you like to be busy, it's a great time because you're working every day.
I don't think they like or relish the opportunity to have to deal with these emergency filings all the time. Because I'm sure the justices believe in the old adage that haste makes waste, and these issues are very important for the conduct of society, and for them to have to issue 1- and 2-page orders upsetting the status quo is probably, I think, disconcerting for them.
Joe, let's go back to Venezuela for a moment. If you touched on this earlier and I missed it, I'm sorry. I was putting out fires for a few minutes in the beginning of this interview, so I missed a couple key points you were making. Some have said that this recent argument by the Supreme Court contradicts the argument when we were dealing with deporting people to Salvadoran prisons. Do you see anything that would be a conflict in terms of those two decisions?
I do, because, look, these... can you imagine you're a Venezuelan, you fled your country for fear of your life. You're welcomed here. You're given a legal status. You're told how to deal with your presence here and file your paperwork and keep in touch with Homeland Security folks and immigration folks. So you're doing everything correctly. You're told that your protective status continues until the middle of next year. And then that's yanked out from under you. And the fear you would have now is, okay, I'm no longer welcome here. I'm going to go home. Well, that's not an option. But the real fear is, are you going to be sent somewhere else to to South Sudan, which is in turmoil, or to Libya, which is a failed state, or you're going to be sent to El Salvador in that prison? I mean, those are the fears that be running through your mind. It's got to be terrifying. And so while there's an interplay here between what's going to happen to these Venezuelans who were here legally and what's happening to those folks who are here illegally and being sent out of the country to far-flung places across the globe, and the use of the Alien Enemies Act to do that with these illegal immigrants, those are matters that are still bubbling up through the courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately is going to decide that. Remember the case of Abrego Garcia, the Maryland guy who was sent to CCOT, the prison in El Salvador. That case is still pending as to whether or not that was the proper use of the Alien Enemies Act, and whether the Trump administration was appropriately proved that he and others like him were enemy combatants or invaders of this country, which is what the Alien Enemies Act requires proof of. So those cases are bubbling through, but you can see the interplay here between what's happening with those illegal immigrants and what's happening with these Venezuelans.
What is the latest on that, where the courts were ordering the Trump administration to be a little quicker in terms of showing some activity in regarding bringing him and maybe some others back to the country? Did they just run out the clock on them on that effectively?
No, the judge, that still sits in, the famous, the judge who became famous, I guess, Judge Boasberg, that's still in his court, and he's evaluating, as are other district court judges, whether the Trump administration has violated court orders in not getting these people back or still sending them out of the country. So right now, I think there's a couple hearings that are contempt hearings, to see whether the Department of Justice and Homeland Security should be held in contempt. And the Trump administration is claiming, well, we can't even disclose where we sent these people or what we're doing with them because it's a matter of national security. So that's their argument as to why they're not even giving some of these judges the information necessary to decide what's going on here. So there's a real tension involved right now, and I suspect these cases will continue to percolate up through the court system until they ultimately land on the desks of the justices at the Supreme Court. The concern I would have, just as my humanitarian side would say, some of these people's lives are greatly affected here. I understand some were gang members and some were very dangerous people, and we don't want them here. But I would hope the government be able to offer proof that those people are who we say they are.
Well, there's an interesting thing that's happening with the Abrego Garcia case in particular, and that is the administration is changing the argument along the way and have made him political poison. Yeah, well, okay, but maybe he wasn't an invader, but he did beat his wife, and he was a gang member, and it makes it very difficult to talk about him.
Joe, we're out of time. I appreciate yours. We will talk with you tomorrow on the Big Friday Show.
Okay, fellas, enjoyed it.
Appreciate the research. Thank you, Joe.